Has the environment / climate change question been a difficulty? We know we talk about comprehensive and ambitious and ambition. Well, their ambition and Boris Johnson is largely on climate change this year, hosting the major global summit in November. How much has that been a challenge for you to navigate?
Now, look, the discussions on the environment have been quite straightforward and are not one of the sticking points. We're basically agreed on the approach that we'll take on the environment. That is that multilateral negotiations are where things like emissions reductions are negotiated, but both countries are prepared to commit to work cooperatively on environmental issues, including on emissions reduction, on technology which helps emissions reduction, all those things, the cooperative approach, we've been able to get agreement on, and so that hasn't been one of the major sticking points.
Is the issue of carbon tariffs, border tariffs or adjustments, is that a looming threat? Do you see it as a realistic concern, not just from the UK, but particularly I'm thinking from the European Union?
So when it comes to these bilateral free trade agreements, it's not an issue, but multilaterally it is. And Australia's great concern with carbon border adjustment mechanisms is that they can be used as a protectionist measure. We've already put forward an alternative, and that is that what we would like to see is a reduction in all tariffs when it comes to environmental goods and the freeing up of movement of environmental services. So that means all countries can get access to the technology that they need to reduce emissions and the know-how and expertise to be able to use that technology. We think that's a much more pro-trade approach. That's the approach that all countries should be taking, rather than putting in place barriers, protectionist barriers, which would actually prevent us getting the emissions reduction the globe needs.
It's a realistic threat, though, isn't it, particularly from the EU?
Look, the EU are potentially going to put something on the table, but obviously the first thing they've got to do is make sure that it is WTO consistent. And we'll wait and see what the EU are going to propose, but it's going to be very difficult. For instance, if you look at the scheme that they have in the EU, obviously there's large swathes of their industry which are exempt from their scheme, their emissions reduction scheme. So how they take account of that we have to wait and see. So there are many unknowns when it comes to what the EU are proposing. But as we've made clear, we just think it's the wrong way to go about it. Why wouldn't you come out with a free trade approach which says, let's get rid of all tariffs on environmental goods and let's make sure that when it comes to environmental services, we can ensure that the technology that's needed, that know-how is there for all countries as they reduce their emissions.
Minister, when the Prime Minister talks about the need to get the rules of the road back in place, essentially, is what he said in his speech before leaving for the G7. With the WTO, one of the challenges, as you would know better than anyone, is to get that restored, that organisation. It's not just the democracies in the G7 you need to worry about. You need countries across the board, all members, including China, on board.
That's right. It's a consensus-based organisation, but what we really want to see at the moment is true leadership from G7 countries about reforming the WTO, making sure that it can continue to set the rules that we need that will govern trade into the future, like e-commerce or digital trade, but also making sure that all countries adhere to the rules and we have a properly functioning dispute settlement mechanism. And that's one of the things that we really need G7 countries to be focused on, because if they can show leadership, we think that we can get the outcome we need at the WTO ministerial meeting at the end of this year, which will really pave the way for a reformed World Trade Organisation which starts functioning how the globe needs it to function at this time. You
heard from Andrew earlier in the program, and the question he put to the Singapore Prime Minister. Some interesting views from the Singapore leader. Is there anything that we can learn from that country when it comes to dealing with China?
Well, I think what the Singaporean Prime Minister was saying was that we do need to constructively engage with China, and that's what the Australian government has been trying to do. When it comes to my counterpart in January, I wrote a very comprehensive letter to him setting out all the ways that we could constructively engage, and obviously I'm still waiting for a response to that letter. But if you look at our trading relationship with China, our exports have helped lift millions out of poverty in China, and likewise their imports into Australia have helped us sustain our standard of living here. So constructive relations are in both countries' mutual interest. That's something that we want to see. We understand there will be things that we will have to agree to disagree on, but there are lots of mutual interests of where we can engage and engage constructively.
Finally, has Joe Biden provided some ballast to Australia's forward-leaning approach to China in the fact that the President is very supportive of alliances and including not just ours, but the quadrilateral dialogue and so on? Has it provided ballast to the government's approach on China?
Well, there's a couple of things. First of all, we saw overnight a very historic meeting between President Biden, Prime Minister Johnson and Prime Minister Morrison, where they were able to talk about the challenges in the Indo-Pacific and how the three countries can work together, and that is something which I think all Australians should take reassurance from. The second thing is the US under President Biden have come out very clearly and said that they've got our back and they won't leave us on the field by ourselves, and I think that also is incredibly reassuring. It's a very complex geostrategic environment now in the Indo-Pacific. We want to work with like-minded partners to make sure that we get that rules-based order so that we can pursue the peace and prosperity that we want to see throughout the Indo-Pacific. So I think President Biden has shown very clearly that he wants to work very closely with us, as the US has always, and wants to make sure that our interests are looked after as well as the US's interests and all countries' interests in the Indo-Pacific.
Trade Minister Dan Tehan, appreciate your time. Thanks.
Thanks, Kieran.